a whisper in the dark. The night was a heavy shroud, draped over the fields of Donetsk Oblast, where the stars seemed to hold their breath. A faint hum lingered in the air, not the wind, but something mechanical, distant, predatory. Oleksiy crouched low in the tall grass, his breath shallow, his fingers brushing the cold metal of the radio clipped to his vest. Somewhere out there, beyond the swaying stalks and the shadowed ruins of Robotyne, a drone was circling. Its whine was a ghost's promise, a reminder that danger never slept in this war-torn land. He pressed himself closer to the earth, the damp soil soaking through his uniform, grounding him in the moment. His heart thumped, not with fear alone, but with the weight of what lay ahead. The mission was simple on paper. Deliver supplies to a stranded unit near Verbove, a lifeline of food and medicine through a gauntlet of fire. But simplicity vanished in the face of reality. Minefields, snipers, and the ever-present threat of an ambush. Oleksiy's eyes darted to the horizon, where the faintest glow of artillery flickered like a storm brewing in silence. "Stay low, keep moving," he whispered to himself, a mantra borrowed from his older brother, Mykola, who had taught him to survive the chaos of war. Mykola was gone now, lost in the fog of Bakhmut, but his words lived in Oleksiy's chest, steadying his trembling hands. He adjusted the heavy pack on his shoulders, filled with cans of stew, bandages, and hope that his delivery would mean something to the men and women holding the line. A rustle nearby snapped him back to the present. His hand froze on the radio, his breath caught in his throat. Was it a comrade? An animal? Or something worse? The grass parted slightly, and a figure emerged. Sofiya, the volunteer medic who had insisted on joining him. Her face, smudged with dirt, was set with determination, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of fear. She carried no weapon, only a satchel of medical supplies, her hands steady despite the weight of her choice to be here. "Oleksiy," she whispered, her voice barely louder than the wind. "The drone's closer. We need to move." He nodded, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer than necessary. Sofiya was no soldier, yet here she was, threading through a war zone to save lives she'd never meet. Her courage stirred something in him, a mix of admiration and guilt. Why was she here, risking everything, when she could be safe in Lviv, tending to her garden or teaching her younger sister to play the piano? The question gnawed at him, but there was no time for answers. The drone's hum grew louder, a mechanical heartbeat slicing through the night. Oleksiy gestured toward a cluster of shattered trees, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky. "There," he said softly. "We'll wait it out." They crawled through the grass, the ground cold and unforgiving beneath them. The pack on his back felt heavier with each step, as if it carried not just supplies, but the weight of every life depending on them. They reached the trees, huddling beneath the splintered remains of an oak. The drone's whine faded, then surged again, circling closer. Oleksiy's mind raced. Had they been spotted? He glanced at Sofiya, her face pale but resolute, her hands clutching the satchel as if it were a shield. In that moment, he saw not just a medic, but a woman who had chosen to face the abyss for others. Her presence was a quiet rebellion against the chaos around them. The drone passed overhead, its shadow a fleeting spectre against the moonlit clouds. Oleksiy exhaled, his breath a faint mist in the chilly air. They were still alive, still moving forward. But the night was young, and the road to Verbove stretched out like a promise of trials yet to come. He thought of the soldiers waiting for their supplies, hungry and wounded, their faces unknown, but their need as real as the ground beneath him. This was why he was here, why he hadn't turned back when the first shells fell days ago. As the drone's hum faded into the distance, Oleksiy stood, helping Sofiya to her feet. The fields of Donetsk lay silent for now, but silence here was a fragile thing, easily shattered. They had a mission to complete, a path to forge through the darkness. And somewhere in that darkness, a spark of hope flickered, carried in the weight of their packs and the resolve in their hearts. The fields of Donetsk. The late summer of 2023 hung heavy over Donetsk Oblast, where the earth itself seemed to bear the scars of conflict. The rolling fields, once golden with wheat, now lay trampled and pocked with craters, their edges fringed by clusters of shattered villages. Robotyne-Verbove, two small settlements in the Zaporizhzhia region near the Donetsk border, had become focal points in a broader struggle. Both sides had dug in, their positions marked by trenches and sandbags, creating a jagged line that snaked through the steppe. The air carried the faint tang of smoke, a constant reminder of the artillery exchanges that punctuated the days and nights. The military situation was fluid, a chessboard of advances and retreats. Units from both sides maneuvered across the open terrain, their movements dictated by the need to hold or reclaim ground. Robotyne, a village of modest homes and narrow lanes, had changed hands multiple times, its ruins a testament to the ferocity of earlier clashes. Verbove, a few kilometers east, was no less contested, its fields a patchwork of minefields and makeshift fortifications. The mission to deliver supplies to a stranded unit near Verbove was not just a logistical task, but a thread in a larger tapestry of efforts to maintain a foothold in this contested region. Geographically, the area was both ally and adversary. The flat open steppe offered little cover, exposing anyone who crossed it to the watchful eyes of drones and snipers. Sparse groves of trees, like the one where Oleksiy and Sofiya had taken shelter, provided fleeting refuge, but also concealed dangers, hidden mines or abandoned equipment that could betray a position. The soil, churned by rain and treads, turned to thick mud in places, slowing movement and clinging to boots like a living thing. To the east, low hills rose, offering vantage points for artillery observers, while the horizon stretched endlessly, a canvas for the glow of distant explosions. The weather added its own weight to the struggle. August in Donetsk brought warm days and cool nights, but the season was shifting. A damp chill settled over the fields after dusk, seeping into uniforms and stiffening fingers. Sporadic rain turned paths into quagmires, complicating the delivery of supplies. Clouds often hung low, obscuring the stars but doing little to muffle the sounds of war. Distant booms, the whine of drones, the occasional crack of a rifle. The wind, when it blew, carried dust and the faint scent of burning, a reminder of villages reduced to ash. Beyond the battlefield, the world watched with a mix of concern and detachment. News of the conflict flickered across screens in distant cities where leaders debated sanctions, aid, and diplomacy. Humanitarian efforts strained to keep pace, with organizations scrambling to deliver food, medicine, and shelter to those caught in the crossfire. Volunteers like Sofiya were part of this effort, their work a quiet counterpoint to the louder rhythms of combat. The global stage was a distant echo here, where survival hinged on the immediate, on the next step, the next decision, the next moment of silence or chaos. For the soldiers and volunteers in Donetsk, the broader context was felt in fragments. Radio reports crackled with updates on troop movements or supply shortages, but these were secondary to the immediate reality of the mission. Oleksiy's unit, a mix of seasoned fighters and newer recruits, was tasked with maintaining a supply line to a forward position near Verbove. The stranded unit, cut off by a sudden shift in the front, was running low on essentials: food, water, medical supplies. The path to reach them was a gauntlet, a narrow corridor through contested land where every shadow could conceal a threat. The human cost was unspoken, but ever present. Villages like Robotyne, once home to families and farmers, now stood empty, their windows dark, their walls pocked with shrapnel. Those who remained, soldiers, volunteers, and a few stubborn civilians, moved with the weight of purpose. The fields, though scarred, still held traces of life. Wildflowers clinging to the edges of craters, birds darting through the dawn. These small signs of resilience mirrored the determination of those who pressed forward, like Oleksiy and Sofiya, driven by duty and something deeper, something harder to name. Oleksiy's role as a soldier was not one he had chosen lightly. A mechanic from a small town near Dnipro, he had joined to protect the life he knew, his mother's garden, his sister's laughter, the quiet evenings by the river. Sofiya, a schoolteacher turned medic, had left her classroom to answer a different call, one that pulled her from safety into the heart of the conflict. Their paths had converged here, in the fields of Donetsk, where the stakes were not measured in territory alone, but in lives sustained or lost. As they prepared to move again, the context of their mission loomed large. The supplies in their packs, cans of food, bandages, bottles of water, were more than objects. They were lifelines, fragile threads connecting the stranded to the hope of another day. The path to Verbove was not just a route through mud and grass, but a test of will, a journey through a landscape that demanded everything. The fields of Donetsk, silent under the weight of war, waited to see who would pass through and who would remain. Characters, hearts in the fire. Oleksiy was no stranger to the weight of responsibility. At 26, he carried the lean frame of a man who had grown up working with his hands, his calloused fingers more at home with a wrench than a rifle. Born in a small town outside Dnipro, where the river curved gently through fields of sunflower and rye, he had spent his youth dreaming of building things, engines, bridges, a future. His mother, Halina, ran a modest bakery, her hands always dusted with flour, her laughter a constant in their small home. His younger sister Daria was the dreamer, sketching landscapes in charcoal and talking of studying art in Kiev. Oleksiy had promised to help her get there, to keep their family's quiet life intact. But war had a way of rewriting promises. When the conflict swept closer to home, Oleksiy enlisted, driven by a need to protect the world he loved. His brother, Mykola, had gone first, a soldier whose letters home were filled with quiet resolve. Mykola's death in Bakhmut a year earlier had left a hole in Oleksiy's chest, one he filled with duty. He didn't speak of it often, but the memory lingered in the way he tightened his grip on his pack, as if holding on to his brother's courage. In the fields of Donetsk, Oleksiy was not just a soldier, but a man carrying the weight of those he could still save, each step a defiance of loss. His inner world was a storm of contradictions. Fear was a constant companion, sharp and cold, whispering doubts in the quiet moments before dawn. Would he make it through the night? Would he fail those who depended on him? Yet, there was hope too, a stubborn flame that refused to flicker out. He thought of his mother's bread, warm from the oven, and Daria's sketches pinned to the walls of their home. These were the anchors that kept him moving, even when the mud clung to his boots and the drone's hum echoed in his ears. Duty was his shield, but love was his reason. Sofiya Kovalenko, the volunteer medic, was a different kind of fire. At 32, she had the steady hands of someone who had spent years guiding others, first as a schoolteacher in Lviv, then as a medic in the chaos of war. Her classroom had been a haven of chalk dust and laughter, where she taught children to read poetry and dream beyond the horizon. Her younger sister, Olena, was her mirror, a 16-year-old with a passion for music and a smile that could light up a room. Sofiya had promised Olena she would return to hear her play the piano at her first recital, a promise that now felt as fragile as the glass in their family's old windows. Sofiya had not planned to be here, crouching in the fields of Donetsk with a satchel of bandages and antiseptic. But the war had reached her students, her city, her heart. When she saw the first wounded arrive in Lviv, young men and women with haunted eyes, she knew she could not stay behind. She trained as a medic, learning to stitch wounds and steady her hands under pressure. Her choice to volunteer was not born of bravery, she would say, but of necessity. Someone had to help, and she could not look away. Yet, each step into the war zone carried the weight of her fear, not of death, but of failing those who needed her most. Her inner world was a tapestry of resolve and doubt. She carried the faces of every person she had bandaged, their gratitude and pain etched into her memory. At night, when the world was still, she thought of Olena's piano, the notes rising like a prayer. She wondered if she would ever sit in that recital hall, or if the war would claim that dream too. But there was a quiet strength in Sofiya, a refusal to let despair take root. She saw it in the soldiers she helped, in their fleeting smiles and murmured thanks. To her, each life saved was a note in a larger song, one she was determined to keep playing. Together, Oleksiy and Sofiya were an unlikely pair, bound by circumstance and a shared purpose. Oleksiy admired Sofiya's courage, the way she moved through danger with a calm that seemed to defy the chaos. She saw in him a quiet resilience, a man who carried his grief like a stone but never let it slow his steps. Their conversations, brief and whispered in the dark, were moments of connection, stories of home, of family, of the lives they hoped to return to. Neither spoke of the war's end, for that felt too distant, but they shared a silent understanding. They were here for others, for the stranded unit waiting in Verbove, for the flickering hope that kept them moving. Oleksiy's pack was heavy, but his heart was heavier, filled with the faces of those he had lost and those he still fought for. Sofiya's satchel was light by comparison, but its contents were a lifeline, each bandage a promise to keep someone breathing. In the fields of Donetsk, they were not heroes in the way stories often painted them. They were people, scared and determined, carrying their pasts and their hopes into the unknown. The war had brought them here, but it was their humanity, their memories of home, their love for those left behind, that kept them going. As they prepared to move again, the weight of their choices settled over them. Oleksiy thought of his sister's sketches, of the sunflowers she drew with such care. Sofiya thought of her sister's piano, the melody waiting to be played. These were the threads that tethered them to the world beyond the war, the reasons they would face the dangers ahead. The fields of Donetsk stretched out before them, silent and unforgiving, but in their hearts burned a fire that no darkness could extinguish. Movement, the path to Verbove. The night deepened as Oleksiy and Sofiya moved through the fields of Donetsk, their silhouettes blending into the shadowed steppe. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and distant smoke, a reminder of the fragile line between calm and chaos. The path to Verbove was no road at all, just a stretch of uneven ground, marked by ruts and the occasional glint of shrapnel half buried in the mud. Each step was deliberate, guided by the faint glow of a compass in Oleksiy's hand, its needle trembling under the weight of their purpose. The supply mission was a lifeline, a desperate thread connecting the stranded unit in Verbove to the world beyond. Oleksiy's pack, heavy with cans of food and bottles of water, pressed against his shoulders, a constant ache that grounded him in the moment. Sofiya's satchel, lighter but no less vital, held bandages, antiseptic, and syringes, tools to mend what war had torn apart. Together they carried hope, but the weight of it was as real as the mud clinging to their boots. The landscape was both ally and adversary. The open fields offered no cover, only the occasional cluster of wild grass or a shattered tree to break the horizon. In the distance, the ruins of Robotyne loomed, their jagged outlines barely visible against the starless sky. The ground was treacherous, pocked with craters and hidden dangers, mines left like forgotten promises, waiting for a misstep. Oleksiy's eyes scanned the terrain, his training kicking in. Step lightly, avoid the obvious paths, watch for anything that didn't belong. His heart beat in time with his steps, a steady rhythm against the uncertainty. Sofiya moved beside him, her steps quieter, her presence a steadying force. She had no training for this, no drills to fall back on, yet her focus was unshakable. Her eyes, sharp despite the darkness, darted to the ground, searching for signs of danger. Oleksiy noticed the way she clutched her satchel, her knuckles pale, but her grip firm. She was no soldier, but her resolve was a kind of armor, forged in the classrooms of Lviv and tempered by the faces of the wounded she had tended. The sounds of the night were a chorus of warnings. The distant rumble of artillery rolled like thunder, too far to be an immediate threat, but close enough to tighten the chest. A faint mechanical hum lingered in the air. Drones, always drones, their presence a constant shadow. Somewhere to the east, a flare arced into the sky, its brief light casting eerie shadows across the fields. Oleksiy froze, motioning for Sofiya to do the same. They crouched low, the grass brushing against their faces, their breaths shallow. The flare faded, leaving only darkness and the pounding of their pulses. Clear, Oleksiy whispered after a moment, his voice barely audible. Sofiya nodded, her eyes meeting his in a fleeting exchange of trust. They rose and continued, the silence between them filled with unspoken questions. How far to Verbove? Would the unit still be there? Would they make it through the night? Oleksiy pushed the thoughts aside, focusing on the compass, on the next step, on the mission that tethered him to purpose. The journey was punctuated by moments of unexpected beauty, fragile against the weight of their task. A patch of wildflowers, their petals ghostly in the moonlight, swayed in a brief gust of wind. A lone bird, startled by their approach, took flight, its wings a soft flutter in the stillness. These glimpses of life felt like gifts, reminders of the world beyond the war. Oleksiy thought of his sister's sketches, the way she captured the curve of a river or the tilt of a sunflower. He wondered if she would draw this place, if she could find beauty in its scars. Sofiya, too, found her mind drifting. The rhythm of their steps reminded her of the metronome on Olena's piano, steady and unyielding. She imagined her sister practicing, her fingers dancing across the keys, unaware of the dangers Sofiya faced. The thought was both a comfort and a pang, a reminder of why she was here. She had seen too many young lives cut short, too many families torn apart. Each bandage in her satchel was a small act of defiance, a refusal to let the war claim another soul. As they neared a shallow ravine, the terrain shifted, the ground sloping downward into a natural corridor. It offered some cover, but it also funneled them into a narrow path, a gamble they had to take. Oleksiy led the way, his boots sinking into the soft earth, his eyes scanning for tripwires or disturbed soil. The ravine was quiet. Too quiet, the kind of stillness that felt like the world holding its breath. He glanced back at Sofiya, her face pale but resolute, and felt a surge of respect. She was here, not because she had to be, but because she chose to be. Halfway through the ravine, a new sound broke the silence, a low, rhythmic thump, like a heartbeat in the distance. Oleksiy's stomach tightened. It was the sound of a vehicle, too heavy for a drone, too close for comfort. He gestured for Sofiya to drop low, and they pressed themselves against the ravine's earthen wall, the cold seeping through their clothes. The thump grew louder, then faded, a patrol passing nearby but not close enough to spot them. Oleksiy exhaled, his breath a faint mist in the chilly air. They waited, counting seconds until the silence returned. "We're close," Oleksiy said softly, checking the compass. Verbove was less than a kilometer away, but the final stretch was the most dangerous. Open ground, exposed to the eyes above and the threats hidden below. He adjusted his pack, the straps cutting into his shoulders, and met Sofiya's gaze. "Ready?" She nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "For them," she said, her voice steady, despite the fear in her eyes. She was thinking of the soldiers waiting in Verbove, their faces unknown, but their need as real as the satchel in her hands. Oleksiy felt the weight of her words, a reminder of the lives they carried with them. They emerged from the ravine, the field stretching out before them like a dark sea. The horizon glowed faintly, not with dawn, but with the distant flicker of fire. The air grew colder, the wind carrying the sharp edge of autumn. Oleksiy's mind flickered to his mother's kitchen, the warmth of her bread, the safety of a life that felt impossibly far away. Sofiya thought of Olena's laughter, the way it filled their small apartment in Lviv. These memories were their fuel, pushing them forward through the mud and the fear. As they moved, the tension grew, a tightening coil in their chests. Every rustle of grass, every shift in the wind felt like a warning. Oleksiy's hand rested on the radio at his side, its static a faint lifeline to the world beyond. Sofiya's fingers brushed the straps of her satchel, a silent promise to those waiting. The path to Verbove was not just a journey through the fields, but a test of their resolve, a gauntlet that demanded everything they had. The night stretched on, vast and unforgiving, but they kept moving, step by step, toward the unknown. The supplies they carried were heavy, but the hope they bore was heavier still, a fragile spark in the darkness, guiding them toward Verbove and the lives that depended on them. The battle begins. Shadows of ambush. The fields of Donetsk held their breath as Oleksiy and Sofiya neared Verbove, the horizon flickering with the faint pulse of artillery. The night was a canvas of shadows, the air heavy with the promise of rain. They had crossed the open steppe, their steps careful but urgent, guided by the dim glow of Oleksiy's compass. The stranded unit was close now, holed up in a cluster of ruined buildings on the outskirts of Verbove, their supplies dwindling with each passing hour. Oleksiy's pack, laden with food and water, felt like an anchor, grounding him in the mission. Sofiya's satchel, filled with medical supplies, was a lighter burden but no less vital, a lifeline for the wounded waiting in the dark. They moved low, crouching through a patch of tall grass that swayed like whispers in the wind. The silence was deceptive, a fragile veil over the chaos that could erupt at any moment. Oleksiy's eyes scanned the terrain, his training a steady hum in his mind. Watch the shadows. Listen for the unnatural. Trust your instincts. Sofiya followed close behind, her breath steady but her hands tight around her satchel. The weight of their task pressed against them, but so did the unspoken bond that had grown in the hours they'd spent together, threading through danger. The first sign of trouble came as a faint crack, sharp and sudden, like a branch snapping underfoot. Oleksiy froze, his hand shooting up to signal Sofiya. She dropped to one knee, her eyes wide but focused, searching the darkness. The sound had come from their left, where a low ridge rose, its crest fringed with the skeletal remains of trees. Oleksiy's heart thudded, his mind racing through possibilities. A stray animal, a falling branch, or something far worse. He gestured for Sofiya to stay low and crept forward, his boots sinking into the soft earth, his senses straining for any clue. Another crack, closer this time, followed by a low hum that sent a chill down his spine. A drone, its mechanical whine cutting through the night like a blade. Oleksiy's stomach tightened as he scanned the sky, but the clouds were thick, hiding the machine's silhouette. He motioned for Sofiya to move toward a nearby ditch, a shallow scar in the earth that offered meager cover. They scrambled into it, the mud cold against their hands, their bodies pressed close to the ground. The drone's hum grew louder, then faded, circling somewhere above but not locking onto them. For now, we're too close to turn back, Oleksiy whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. Sofiya nodded, her face pale but resolute, her fingers brushing the straps of her satchel as if grounding herself. They waited, counting seconds, until the drone's whine receded into the distance, but the relief was short-lived. As they rose to continue, a new sound shattered the silence, a burst of static from Oleksiy's radio, loud and jarring in the stillness. He fumbled to silence it, his fingers clumsy with adrenaline, but the damage was done. The static had been a beacon, a betrayal of their position. Before he could speak, a flare arced into the sky from the ridge, its harsh light casting the fields in a ghostly glow. Shadows danced across the grass, and Oleksiy's blood ran cold. They had been spotted. The mission, so carefully planned, was unraveling in a heartbeat. "Run!" he hissed, grabbing Sofiya's arm. They bolted from the ditch, their boots pounding against the earth, the supplies in their packs jarring with each step. The flare's light faded, plunging them back into darkness. But the damage was done. From the ridge came the sound of movement. Boots on gravel, the clink of metal, voices too distant to make out but too close for comfort. An ambush was forming, a net closing around them. Oleksiy's mind raced, his training clashing with instinct. The direct path to Verbove was compromised, but turning back was not an option. The stranded unit needed them. He scanned the terrain, his eyes catching on a cluster of ruined farmhouses 100 meters away, their walls crumbling but offering cover. "There," he said, pointing. Sofiya nodded, her breath ragged, but her steps sure. They ran, the grass whipping at their legs, the weight of their packs a constant pull. As they reached the farmhouses, Oleksiy pulled Sofiya behind a collapsed wall, its stones rough against their backs. The air was thick with tension, the sounds of pursuit growing closer, boots crunching, a low murmur of voices. Oleksiy's hand hovered over his radio, but he dared not use it, not now. Instead, he met Sofiya's gaze, her eyes a mirror of his own fear and determination. "We need a diversion," he whispered, his mind racing through options. Sofiya's brow furrowed, then her face lit with a spark of resolve. "The flare," she said softly, reaching into her satchel. She pulled out a small signal flare, one meant for marking a safe zone for evacuation. "If we set it off away from us, it might draw them off." Oleksiy hesitated, the risk clear. Lighting a flare would expose their general area, but it could buy them time. He nodded, trusting her instinct. They crawled to the edge of the farmhouse, where a pile of debris offered a clear line of sight to the open field. Sofiya's hands were steady as she prepared the flare, her fingers deft despite the cold. Oleksiy scanned the ridge, his heart pounding as he spotted movement, figures moving cautiously, their silhouettes barely visible. "Now," he whispered. Sofiya ignited the flare, its bright red light hissing to life. She hurled it into the field, away from their position, and it landed with a soft thud, its glow a beacon in the darkness. For a moment, the world held still. Then, shouts erupted from the ridge, followed by the sound of boots shifting direction. The figures moved toward the flare, their attention drawn to the false signal. Oleksiy and Sofiya didn't wait to see more. They slipped from the farmhouse, moving low and fast toward Verbove, their path now a narrow window of opportunity. The final stretch was a blur of motion and adrenaline. The ruins of Verbove loomed ahead, their outlines jagged against the horizon. Oleksiy's legs burned, his pack a relentless weight, but he pushed forward, driven by the thought of the soldiers waiting, hungry, wounded, counting on them. Sofiya matched his pace, her satchel bouncing against her hip, her face set with a quiet ferocity. They were a team now, their movements synchronized, their trust unspoken but absolute. As they neared the outskirts, a new challenge emerged. The ground ahead was pocked with craters, the remnants of earlier shelling, and the air carried the faint hum of another drone. Oleksiy's heart sank, but he didn't falter. He gestured toward a narrow alley between two shattered buildings, its shadows offering a chance to hide. They ducked into it, their breaths heavy, their bodies pressed against the cold stone. The drone passed overhead, its hum a fleeting threat, and Oleksiy felt a surge of relief. They were close. So close. But the ambush had left its mark. Oleksiy's mind churned with doubt. Had they been followed? Was the unit still there? Sofiya's hand brushed his arm, a small gesture that steadied him. "We're almost there," she said, her voice low but firm. "They need us." Her words were a lifeline, pulling him back from the edge of fear. They emerged from the alley, the stranded unit's position just ahead, a cluster of low buildings, their windows dark, but their presence a promise. Oleksiy's radio crackled faintly, a voice breaking through the static. "Supply team, report!" He hesitated, then pressed the button, his voice steady despite the chaos. "We're here," he said. "We're coming." The battle had begun, not with gunfire or explosions, but with a desperate race through the night, a test of wits and will. Oleksiy and Sofiya had faced the ambush and emerged, their mission intact but their journey far from over. The fields of Verbove waited, silent and unforgiving, as they carried their hope forward, one step at a time. The sacrifice, a choice in the ruins. The outskirts of Verbove were a graveyard of stone and shadow, where the skeletal remains of buildings stood like sentinels over a silent battlefield. Oleksiy and Sofiya had reached their destination, the stranded unit's position just beyond a cluster of shattered homes. The air was thick with the acrid scent of smoke, and the distant rumble of artillery felt like a pulse beneath the earth. Their packs, heavy with supplies, were a lifeline for the soldiers waiting. Soldiers who had held their ground through days of dwindling rations and mounting wounds. But the path to them was not yet clear. Oleksiy crouched behind a crumbling wall, his breath shallow, his eyes scanning the dark alley ahead. Sofiya knelt beside him, her satchel clutched tightly, her face etched with determination despite the exhaustion that tugged at her features. The ambush in the fields had left them shaken but unbroken, their resolve hardened by the nearness of their goal. The radio at Oleksiy's side crackled faintly, a voice cutting through the static. "Supply team, status." He pressed the button, his voice steady. "We're at the edge, moving in." But the alley was a gauntlet. The open ground beyond the buildings was exposed, a stretch of no man's land where drones and unseen eyes could strike without warning. Oleksiy's mind raced, mapping the terrain from memory. The unit was holed up in a fortified basement beneath a collapsed school, its entrance hidden but vulnerable. To reach it, they would need to cross the open ground, a risk that weighed heavier with each passing second. As they prepared to move, a new sound pierced the night, a low, guttural groan from the shadows to their right. Oleksiy's hand froze on his pack, his heart lurching. He signaled for Sofiya to stay low and crept toward the sound, his boots silent against the rubble. In the dim light, he saw a figure slumped against a shattered wall. A soldier, his uniform torn, his face pale and streaked with dirt. The man's leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, his hands clutching a radio that had gone silent. "Sofiya," Oleksiy whispered urgently, waving her over. She moved quickly, her medic's instincts taking over as she knelt beside the wounded soldier. His eyes fluttered open, glassy with pain but alive. "You're the supply team?" he rasped, his voice barely audible. Sofiya nodded, her hands already reaching into her satchel for bandages and a tourniquet. "We're here," she said softly, her voice a steady anchor. "You're going to be okay." The soldier's name was Taras, a young man from Kharkiv who had been part of a scouting team sent to secure the route. His unit had been caught in a sudden barrage, scattered by the chaos. He had dragged himself here, hoping to signal for help, but his radio was damaged and his strength was fading. Sofiya worked quickly, her hand steady as she wrapped the tourniquet around his leg, her face a mask of focus. Oleksiy watched, his chest tight with admiration and fear. Every second they spent here increased their risk, but leaving Taras was not an option. The distant hum of a drone returned, sharper now, closer. Oleksiy's eyes darted to the sky, then to the open ground ahead. The unit was waiting, their need as urgent as Taras's, but the drone's presence was a ticking clock. He crouched beside Sofiya, his voice low. "We can't stay here. The drone will spot us." Sofiya's hands paused, her eyes meeting his. "He can't walk," she said, her voice firm but laced with worry. "If we leave him, he won't make it." The decision hung between them, heavy as the packs they carried. To move Taras would slow them down, risking the mission and their own lives. To leave him was to abandon a man who had fought to survive, whose eyes still held a flicker of hope. Oleksiy's mind churned, his brother's voice echoing from a distant memory. "You do what's right, even when it's hard." He thought of his sister, Daria, and the promise to protect her world. He thought of the soldiers waiting, their faces unknown, but their need as real as Taras's. Sofiya's gaze was steady, her resolve a mirror to his own. "We take him," she said, her voice leaving no room for doubt. "We carry him to the unit. They'll have a medic who can do more." Oleksiy nodded, the weight of her words settling over him. It was a choice that could cost them everything, but it was the only one they could live with. Oleksiy slung his pack onto his back, then bent to help Taras. The soldier was heavier than he looked, his body limp with pain, but Oleksiy's arms were strong, fueled by purpose. Sofiya took Taras's other side, her satchel bouncing against her hip as they lifted him. His groans were soft, muffled by gritted teeth, but he clung to them, his hands gripping their arms like lifelines. Together they moved toward the alley's end, the open ground looming like a judgment. The drone's hum grew louder, a mechanical predator circling above the clouds. Oleksiy's heart pounded, his senses sharp as they reached the edge of the alley. The school was visible now, its collapsed roof a jagged silhouette against the horizon. The basement entrance was just beyond, a shadowed doorway that promised safety, if they could reach it. But the open ground was a death trap, exposed to the sky, and whatever threats lay hidden. "We go now," Oleksiy said, his voice low but firm. Sofiya nodded, her face set with determination. They moved as one, half carrying, half dragging Taras across the field. The ground was uneven, pocked with craters and littered with debris. Each step was a gamble, each second a prayer. The drone's hum was a constant threat, its presence a weight on their shoulders, heavier than Taras himself. Halfway across, the world erupted. A flare shot into the sky, its light blinding, casting their shadows long and stark against the earth. Oleksiy's breath caught, his instincts screaming to run. But Taras's weight anchored them. Sofiya's eyes met his, a silent agreement passing between them. They couldn't stop. They pushed forward, their steps frantic but steady, the school's entrance growing closer with each labored breath. The flare faded, plunging them back into darkness. But the damage was done. Voices echoed from the distance, sharp and urgent, followed by the crack of a rifle, not aimed at them, but close enough to send a jolt through Oleksiy's spine. He tightened his grip on Taras, his muscles burning, his mind focused on the doorway ahead. Sofiya's breath was ragged, her face streaked with sweat and dirt, but she didn't falter. She was thinking of Olena, of the piano waiting in Lviv, of the lives she could still save. They reached the school, collapsing into the shadowed entrance, just as another flare lit the sky. Oleksiy pulled Taras down the steps, Sofiya close behind, her satchel clutched tightly. The basement was a haven of dim light and hushed voices, the stranded units' faces emerging from the gloom, worn, hungry, but alive. A medic rushed forward, taking Taras from them, and Oleksiy felt a wave of relief, so sharp, it was almost pain. But the moment was fleeting. The radio crackled again, the unit's commander speaking in a low, urgent tone. "They're closing in. We need to move the supplies now." Oleksiy and Sofiya exchanged a glance, their choice to save Taras now a pivot point in the mission. They had reached the unit, but the danger was far from over. The drone's hum lingered above, and the voices outside grew closer. Their sacrifice had saved one life, but the cost was a new gauntlet, one they would face together. Aftermath. The silence of Verbove. The basement beneath the shattered school in Verbove was a cocoon of dim light and hushed breaths, its air thick with the scent of damp stone and antiseptic. Oleksiy leaned against a rough-hewn wall, his pack discarded at his feet. Its contents, cans of stew, bottles of water, now in the hands of the stranded unit. Sofiya sat nearby, her satchel open, her hand still as she watched the unit's medic tend to Taras, whose labored breathing filled the space like a fragile metronome. The mission was complete, the supplies delivered, but the weight of their journey lingered, heavy as the shadows pooling in the corners. Outside, the night was quiet, but it was the kind of silence that pressed against the ears, a pause between heartbeats. The drone's hum had faded, the voices from the ridge gone still, but the threat remained, woven into the fabric of the war-torn fields. Oleksiy's body ached, his shoulders raw from the pack's straps, his legs trembling from the sprint across the open ground. Yet it was his mind that bore the deeper strain, replaying the flare's blinding light, the crack of the rifle, the moment he and Sofiya chose to carry Taras rather than run. The unit, a small group of soldiers with weary faces and patched uniforms, moved with quiet purpose. A young woman with a bandaged arm distributed the food, her hand steady despite her own hunger. A man with a weathered face, the commander, murmured thanks as he checked the supplies, his eyes betraying a relief he wouldn't voice. Taras, now stabilized, lay on a makeshift cot, his chest rising and falling, a testament to Sofiya's quick work and their shared resolve. Each glance, each nod, was a thread in the tapestry of gratitude that bound them all in this moment. Sofiya's hands rested in her lap, her fingers still smudged with dirt and antiseptic. She stared at them, as if they held the answers to questions she hadn't yet formed. The faces of the wounded she'd tended over months flickered through her mind. Soldiers, civilians, young and old, each one a note in a song she couldn't stop singing. She thought of Olena, her sister, practicing piano in Lviv, unaware of the risks Sofiya had taken tonight. The thought was a lifeline, pulling her back from the edge of exhaustion, reminding her why she was here. Oleksiy's gaze drifted to the ceiling, where cracks spiderwebbed through the concrete, a map of the war's toll. He thought of his mother's bakery, the warmth of her kitchen, the way she hummed as she kneaded dough. He thought of Daria's sketches, pinned to the walls of their home, each one a dream of a world untouched by conflict. The memory was a pang, sharp and bittersweet, but it steadied him. He had carried the supplies for them, for the soldiers, for the life he hoped to return to. But the cost was etched in the lines of his face, in the tremor of his hands as he reached for his canteen. The aftermath was not measured in victories or losses, but in the quiet that followed. The fields outside were a canvas of ruin, craters like open wounds, grass trampled into mud, the faint glint of shrapnel catching the moonlight. The school above them was a husk, its classrooms reduced to rubble, its chalkboards shattered. Yet, within this destruction, life persisted. The soldiers shared the food, their voices low but laced with gratitude. A young man offered Sofiya a sip from his flask, his smile faint but genuine. Another passed Oleksiy a piece of bread, a small gesture that carried the weight of camaraderie. The commander approached, his steps heavy but deliberate. "You got us through," he said, his voice rough but sincere. "We were down to nothing." Oleksiy nodded, unable to find words, his throat tight with the weight of what they'd faced. Sofiya met the commander's gaze, her eyes steady. "Taras will make it," she said, her voice soft but certain. The commander's nod was a silent acknowledgement, a recognition of the sacrifice that had brought them here. But the silence held a cost. The ambush in the fields had delayed them, exposing their position, and the unit's safety was temporary. The radio crackled intermittently, reports of movement on the ridge suggesting the night was not yet done with them. Oleksiy felt the weight of that truth, a stone in his chest. They had saved Taras, delivered the supplies, but the war was a relentless tide, washing away moments of reprieve as quickly as they came. The fields of Verbove, though quiet now, were a stage for the next act, one they could not predict. Sofiya rose, her movements slow but purposeful, and began checking the wounded. Her hands moved with the precision of practice, wrapping bandages, checking pulses, offering quiet words of comfort. Each touch was a defiance of the chaos outside, a refusal to let despair take root. Oleksiy watched her, struck by the contrast, her slight frame against the hulking ruins, her calm against the storm they'd survived. She was a beacon, not of light, but of purpose, and he drew strength from her presence. The basement grew quieter as the soldiers settled, their hunger eased, their wounds tended. Oleksiy found himself beside Taras, whose eyes were closed but whose breathing was steadier now. The young soldier's hand twitched, as if reaching for something in a dream. Oleksiy wondered what Taras saw. His home in Kharkiv, a family waiting, a life paused by the war. The thought mirrored his own, a reflection of Daria's laughter, his mother's voice calling him to dinner. These were the anchors that kept them human, even here in the heart of ruin. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the faint scent of rain. The fields lay still, their scars hidden by the dark, but Oleksiy could picture them, Mud churned into chaos, wildflowers crushed but stubborn, their roots clinging to the earth. The war had changed this place, as it had changed them all, but it had not erased the will to endure. The supplies they'd brought were a spark, a fleeting warmth in the cold, and though the night held more dangers, this moment was theirs. Sofiya sat beside Oleksiy, her satchel at her feet, her hands finally still. "We did it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of their journey, the drone's shadow, the flare's light, the choice to save Taras. Oleksiy nodded, his gaze fixed on the cracked ceiling. "For now," he said, his voice soft but heavy. They both knew the truth. The war would not pause, and the silence of Verbove was a fleeting gift. The aftermath was a tapestry of small victories and unspoken costs. The unit would survive another day, their strength renewed by the supplies and Sofiya's care. Taras would live, his pain eased by their sacrifice. But the fields outside waited, their silence a canvas for the next challenge. Oleksiy and Sofiya sat in the dim light, their shoulders touching, their hearts carrying the weight of what they'd done and what still lay ahead. Reflection. A letter unsent. The basement in Verbove was a sanctuary of flickering light, its walls holding the weight of the night's trials. Oleksiy sat on the cold floor, his back against the rough concrete, his pack now empty beside him. The supplies had been distributed, the wounded tended, and the unit's quiet gratitude hung in the air like a fragile melody. Sofiya knelt nearby, repacking her satchel, her hands moving with the slow precision of someone who had given everything. The silence was not empty, but heavy, filled with the echoes of their journey, the drone's hum, the flare's light, the choice to carry Taras through the chaos. Outside, the fields of Donetsk lay still, their scars hidden by the dark. The war was far from over, its rhythm a constant pulse beneath the earth. But this moment was a pause, a breath between heartbeats. Oleksiy's fingers brushed the pocket of his uniform, where a folded piece of paper rested. A letter to his sister, Daria. Unwritten since Bakhmut, but carried in his heart. He had meant to tell her about the sunflowers that still grew in the cracks of this broken land, about the way they turned toward the light despite everything. He hadn't found the words yet, but the need to write them burned brighter now. Sofiya's eyes were distant, her thoughts drifting to Lviv, to Olena's piano, to the recital she had promised to attend. She imagined the notes rising, clear and unbroken, a song that could reach across the miles, and the war to remind her why she was here. The faces of the soldiers she'd helped tonight. Taras, the young woman with the bandaged arm, the commander with his weary nod, were woven into that song, each one a reason to keep going. She glanced at Oleksiy, his face etched with exhaustion, but softened by something unspoken, and felt a quiet kinship. They had faced the night together, and that shared weight had bound them. The letter Oleksiy carried was not just for Daria, but for himself, a way to make sense of the world he'd stepped into. He thought of his mother, Halina, kneading dough in her bakery, her hand steady despite the news of loss. He thought of Mykola, his brother, whose voice still guided him through the dark. The war had taken so much, but it had not taken his will to remember, to hold on to the fragments of home that kept him human. He imagined writing to Daria about the wildflowers he'd seen, their petals fragile but defiant, a mirror to the people who carried on in this place. Sofiya's own letter was unwritten too, a silent promise to Olena. She wanted to tell her sister about the lives she'd touched, about the soldier who'd smiled through his pain, about the way hope flickered even in the ruins, She wanted to describe the fields of Donetsk, not as a battlefield, but as a place where life persisted, where grass grew through the cracks, where stars peeked through the clouds. These were the truths she carried, the ones that kept her moving through the fear and the cold. The basement was quiet now, the soldiers resting, their faces softened by the small reprieve of food and care. Taras slept, his breathing steady, a testament to their choice to save him. The commander sat in a corner, his radio silent, his eyes scanning a map that held no easy answers. Oleksiy and Sofiya were no longer just a soldier and a medic, but part of this fragile community, bound by the act of showing up, of choosing to carry the weight. Oleksiy pulled the paper from his pocket, its edges worn from months of carrying. He unfolded it, revealing a blank page, and stared at it as if it could hold the weight of his thoughts. He wanted to tell Daria that courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to move through it, to carry a pack through a field of shadows, to save a life when the easier path was to run. He wanted to tell her that he was still her brother, still the man who fixed engines and dreamed of bridges, even here in the heart of ruin. Sofiya watched him, her own thoughts turning inward. She imagined writing to Elena, telling her that bravery was not loud or grand, but quiet, like the act of bandaging a wound or sharing a flask in the dark. She wanted to say that war was not just destruction, but a place where people chose each other, where they carried hope as carefully as they carried supplies. Her fingers traced the edge of her satchel, its contents nearly spent, but its purpose undimmed. The war would continue, its shadow stretching beyond this night. But Oleksiy and Sofiya had carved out a moment of meaning. They had delivered more than supplies. They had brought a reminder that humanity endured, that even in the silence of Verbove, there was a pulse of life. The fields outside, scarred and silent, held their own truths, wildflowers that bloomed, stars that shone, people who refused to let go. As dawn crept closer, a faint light filtered through the basement's narrow vents, casting soft shadows across the floor. Oleksiy folded the blank paper and tucked it back into his pocket, a promise to write when the words came. Sofiya closed her satchel, her hands steady, her heart full of the faces she'd helped. They rose together, ready to face whatever the day would bring, their steps lighter for the knowledge that they had made a difference. This story was inspired by real events and people. Some details have been fictionalized for emotional narrative purposes. What does courage mean in the face of war? Is it the choice to carry on, to save one life, to hold on to hope when the world is breaking? Share your thoughts below, and let us know what stories of resilience move you. Subscribe to Ukraine Frontline War Stories for more untold tales of the human spirit, stories that remind us of the light that persists in the darkest moments. Let's reflect together on what it means to be human in a world of conflict.